MSZ-006 Zeta Gundam. This is the machine the entire rest of this video exists because of. Every variant, every upgrade, every alternative configuration with a Zeta in its designation traces its lineage back to this single unit. The MSZ-006 was an AEUG transformable prototype first appearing in the series, and it established the template so thoroughly that nobody in the decades since has found a reason to deviate from its core concept in any meaningful way. In the real world, it's also the most visually celebrated mobile suit the franchise ever produced. The transformation sequence alone set a standard that every subsequent transformable unit has been measured against, and the design language it introduced still defines what a Gundam is supposed to look like to most fans, which makes the failure at the center of its story harder to ignore. This machine, the one that proved transformation could work, the one that proved audiences would stay engaged through a full mechanical transformation sequence, the one whose design influence echoes across 30 years of sequels, was built in a single documented prototype configuration. The entire documented Zeta family tree, all the variants and upgrades and spin-off units we're covering in this video, everything with a Zeta in its name, stems from a single prototype that existed in exactly one form at exactly one point in UC0087. Now, the MSZ-006's transformation mechanism was genuinely groundbreaking for what animated mecha could demonstrate on screen. The series aired at a time when most variable configuration mobile suits were either implied off-screen or handled with minimal animation, and the MSZ-006's designers gave the audience the full sequence, wing shifts, armor reconfiguration, the complete transition, in a way that made the mechanical reality of the unit feel earned rather than assumed. The show's ratings confirmed the approach worked, so the conventional explanation for why the MSZ-006 remained a single prototype is that the transformation mechanism was too complex, too expensive, too mechanically ambitious for the AEUG to replicate at scale during an active conflict. It's a reasonable explanation. It acknowledges the engineering reality without dismissing the show's achievement. And it's also wrong. The show's mechanical design team documented the transformation sequence on screen without any of the budget complications that explanation requires. If the animation budget could support showing the mechanism working in full detail week after week, then the argument that the design was too complex to produce falls apart on its own terms. The transformation mechanism worked. The show proved it worked. The audience saw it work. Which leaves the question nobody has actually answered. If the MSZ-006's defining capability was demonstrably achievable, why did every subsequent Zeta family unit either simplify or abandon the very feature that made the original worth building in the first place? MSZ-011 Zeta Plus. The Zeta Plus was AEUG's attempt to take what the MSZ-006 proved and turn it into hardware they could actually deploy in numbers. Where the MSZ-006 existed as one documented prototype piloted by Camila Badon in UC0087, the MSZ-011 Zeta Plus had documented production runs, which makes its obscurity harder to explain. For all the engineering effort the documented production run represents, the Zeta Plus C1 achieved none of the MSZ-006's cultural footprint. It was built. It was fielded. And almost nobody outside the most dedicated variant catalogs can tell you it existed at all. That's a strange outcome for a machine that was, on paper, the logical next step in the family line. When you set the MSZ-011 Zeta Plus C1 configuration against the MSZ-006 template it was designed to extend, the gap between them is impossible to miss. The MSZ-006 defined the Zeta family's identity through three documented features: the transformation mechanism, the specific armor layout, and the characteristic wing configuration silhouette. The Zeta Plus C1 kept only the last one. The C1 configuration diverged from the prototype's design in documented ways, and the equipment slots and documented loadout options are narrower than the originals. Not because the technology had regressed, but because the production model's design brief had moved away from the experimental toward the immediately deployable. The Define and Mega Blue novel continuity's documentation of this unit's configuration reads like a checklist of what got removed rather than what got added. The machine is lighter, simpler, and easier to manufacture, which is exactly what a mass production model should be. But the documented cost of that simplicity is every capability that made the prototype worth building in the first place. The skeptic will say the Zeta Plus C1 served a different role, and that's a fair reading if you stop at the designation. A mass production model doesn't need to do everything the prototype did. It needs to do one thing reliably at scale, and the C1's documented deployment pattern suggests that's exactly what it was built for. Except the deployment records don't support specialization. The documented units didn't get distributed across different operational roles in a way that would justify the design trade-offs. The documented deployment pattern reflected their operational assignment. That pattern doesn't read like a diversified lineup. It reads like the organization fielding the C1 had no choice but to use it as a substitute for the MSZ-006 because the actual prototype remained irreplaceable. The facts force a plain implication. The MSZ-011 Zeta Plus C served as a substitute for the MSZ-006 in operational deployment, and the documented production numbers reflect that desperation more than they reflect any genuine design confidence. Subscribe and tell us in the comments which Zeta Gundam variant you think was the most misunderstood. Let's get back into it. MSZ-006 Zeta Gundam III. The MSZ-006 appears in supplementary novel continuity. What happens when you rebuild it without a war forcing your hand? The answer is a machine whose documented specifications make the original look like an early draft. The MSZ-006 carries the Zeta Gundam name explicitly because it is a direct upgrade of the MSZ-006 airframe, but the gap between them isn't incremental. The MSZ-006 piece frame features enhanced armor ratings, beam weaponry output, and engine performance over the base unit. The transformation mechanism reappears here. The Define and Mega Blue continuity restores and refines the capability that the production model's Zeta variants had stripped away, and does so on an airframe whose reinforcement and structural documentation reads like the original's design brief finally received the budget it was denied in UC-0087. Put a number on the gap and it gets starker. The UC-0088 setting isn't incidental to what this machine represents. By that point in the timeline, the MSZ-006 had already proven what it could do under Camille Badon in UC-0087. The MSZ-006's documented weapon output and armor ratings don't build on that performance. They surpass it by enough that the 3 isn't an upgraded version of the prototype. It's a different order of machine wearing the same name. The Define and Mega Blue continuity doesn't present this unit as a refit or a field modification. It presents it as the completed version of a design that was always supposed to exist, held back in UC-0087 by the emergency conditions that defined that year, and finally given room to breathe a year later when those conditions had shifted. That makes the MSZ-006's existence quietly strange, in a way the rest of the variant line isn't. Every other unit in this video exists because someone was trying to replicate, improve on, or work around the MSZ-006's original configuration under constraint. The Free exists because someone in the Define and Mega Blue continuity was allowed to finish the design. The variant family's unspoken through line has always been scarcity and compromise. What happens when your best machine can't be everywhere, when your prototype can't be mass-produced, when your production model can't match the original? The MSZ-006 breaks that pattern by demonstrating that the technology was never the limiting factor. The human cost of that demonstration is a single unit in a novel timeline, documented in a continuity that the primary anime never reached. Carrying the name of a machine that UC-0087 proved the world wasn't ready for until UC-088 showed that readiness was never the issue. The time was MSZ-008 Zeta. The unit assigned to Camille Badon aboard the Argama during ZZ Gundam, UC-089, sits in the Zeta family tree at a position the records don't quite explain. The previous entry was a novel origin custom upgrade built on the MSZ-006 frame, specialized for a single pilot and a specific conflict. This one affects everything around it: the Argama's entire mobile suit complement, the war it fought in, and the pilot who would fly it. The official documentation lists it as a straightforward succession model, a replacement for the original Zeta Gundam, but the designation suggests something more complicated. MSZ-008 occupies the same series number block as MSZ-006. The Zeta Plus units the A1, the C1, the C2, carry a completely different block, the MSZ-011, which means they belong to a separate production lineage entirely, despite what the marketing materials implied. The Argama's complement in UC008-9 included this unit alongside those others, as if they were interchangeable parts of the same program, when the designations were signaling something different. Camila Bedon was assigned to pilot this unit aboard the Argama in UC008-9, placing a transformable mobile suit in the hands of the same pilot who had made the original Zeta Gundam famous, as if the relationship between pilot and machine was what defined the lineage rather than the frame's actual engineering. The official documentation positioned the MSZ-008 as a successor model, a natural evolution of the MSZ-006 that the Argama's crew could deploy immediately after the Gryps Conflict, and nobody questioned whether it shared any meaningful hardware heritage with the Zeta Plus units being fielded alongside it. The series designation is the entire point. MSZ-008 sits in the MSZ block, the same block as the original Zeta Gundam, while every Zeta Plus variant sits in MSZ-011. Those are different development programs, different design bureaus, different production chains. The word Zeta in the Zeta Plus name was a branding decision, not a statement of technical kinship. The Zeta II was the actual next entry in the Zeta Gundam series, the unit that carried the program's real lineage forward, while the Zeta Plus line was a parallel mass production track that happened to share a name. The Argama was carrying both and treating them as a unified family, which is exactly the kind of organizational confusion that happens when you name a machine after a famous predecessor without changing its official classification. The problem was structural. Any pilot stepping into the ZE after flying the original MSZ-006 would find a machine that shared the transformable frame concept but was built around a different set of operational assumptions. The original Zeta was designed for a single ace pilot running deep strikes against a specific enemy fleet. The Zeta was being issued to general complement rotations on a warship juggling multiple mission profiles, colony support, intercept patrols, defensive screens, none of which had existed when the MSZ-006 was first drawn up. The frame that worked for Camille Bedin on a solo Gryps Conflict mission had to work for whoever happened to be available on whatever task the Argama's commanders decided was urgent that week. Nobody designed for that transition because the assumption was that the ZI was just a Zeta and therefore the learning curve was negligible. Character motivation didn't matter. That was the gap between the name and the machine. The ZI looked like an upgrade because it inherited the designation, but it was actually a different machine asking for a different set of skills, handed to a pilot who had been trained for a different war entirely. MSZ-011 Zeta Plus A1. The previous entry was a transformable mobile suit so closely identified with a single pilot and a single war that it might as well have been custom built. This one is everywhere, mass-produced, issued in bulk, and distributed across so many units that by UC008-9, it had become the default transformable mobile suit of the post-Gryps era. Its very name announces its relationship to the Zeta Gundam, and that name has caused more confusion among the people who study these machines than any other designation in the lineup. The MSZ-011 Zeta Plus A1 is a mass-production transformable mobile suit fielded in UC008-9, appearing in ZZ Gundam alongside the Argama's complement, and it was built to be manufactured in numbers the original MSZ-006 could never have supported. The A1 variant is the baseline version of the Zeta Plus line, the model from which the C1 and C2 were later derived. It carries the same transformable frame architecture as the original Zeta Gundam, the ability to reconfigure from mobile suit to Wave Rider configuration, but the internal structure, the construction methods, and the production setup were all redesigned for factory output rather than artisanal assembly. Anna Maria and May have documented the specific production figures and the timeline of deployment across ZZ Gundam, and the numbers are substantial enough to have fundamentally altered the mobile suit balance of the post-Gryps period. The A1 was built to fill the role the Zeta Gundam had made famous, but in numbers that could actually be sustained across a peacetime drawdown and the various flashpoints that kept erupting in the late 0080s. The research community spent considerable energy trying to determine whether the Zeta Plus A1 was a derivative of the MSZ-006 or a clean sheet design that borrowed its transformation mechanism. The ZI had settled that question for itself by occupying the MSZ block and making the succession explicit. The Zeta Plus line never made that claim. It arrived with the MSA designation and the borrowed name. And the ambiguity about its origins persisted through every catalog revision. What researchers found hardest to pin down was not its capabilities, but its parentage. Which frame did it actually descend from? And at what point in the development timeline did the AEUG decide that Zeta was a useful brand to attach to a machine that was not, strictly speaking, a Zeta at all? The documents were inconsistent. The test footage from the early trials showed a machine with clear structural similarities to the MSZ-006 Waverider form, but the internal layout suggested an independent design path that had converged on the same solution rather than inherited it. What distinguishes the Zeta Plus A1 from the later variants, what makes it specifically the A1 and not the C1 or C2, is its equipment configuration and its role in the production sequence. The C1 was a Karaba fielding with modified storage racks for atmospheric operations. The C2 was a command-type variant with enhanced command systems and a different head sensor array. The A1 was the base. Standard configuration, standard loadout, the version that the factories were tooled to produce when the contracts were signed in the immediate aftermath of the Gryps conflict. It did not have the specialized equipment of its siblings because it was not designed for a specific theater. It was designed to be the default, the machine a pilot would draw from the ready rack without needing to file a mission-specific requisition. People assume the Zeta Plus A1 is just a cheaper Zeta Gundam, and the Zeta in the name is doing the work of convincing them of that. It is not a Zeta. The designation MSA-011 places it in a completely separate production line from the MSZ series Zeta Gundam and MSZ-008 Zeta. It shares the transformation concept. Both machines convert between Mobile Suit and Waverider configurations, but the frame architecture, the development lineage, and the organizational ownership are all different. A Zeta is an MSZ. A Zeta Plus is an MSA. The name creates the confusion, the number is the actual record. This machine was built for mass production, not for a single pilot, not for a specific war, and not for the kind of heroics that made the MSZ-006 famous. It was built for the units that had to keep flying after the heroes went home. The reason it exists in this configuration with this designation is that the AEUG needed a transformable mobile suit they could manufacture without depending on Anaheim Electronics' proprietary Zeta program tooling, which was built around single-unit production and was prohibitively expensive to replicate at scale. The Zeta Plus line was the solution to that problem, a machine that looked like a Zeta, moved like a Zeta, but came from a different design pipeline that could be handed to subordinate manufacturers and turned out in quantity. The Zeta name was the bridge that let pilots and commanders accept it without needing to relearn their tactics, but the MSA block confirmed that this was a different machine for a different era. Not a sequel, but a parallel track that happened to wear the same label. MSA-010A Zeta Plus C1. The previous item was the baseline version of a machine designed to be issued in bulk, standard configuration, standard role, the default you drew from the rack. This one left the rack with a specific assignment, a specific modification, and a specific theater that changed everything about how it operated and why it was built that way. The C1 variant of the Zeta Plus line is an AEUG and Karaba mass production transformable variant fielded post-0089, which means it was built after the events that defined the Gryps conflict, built after Camille Biden's war, built for a peace that kept breaking into something that looked very much like the conflict everyone thought they had finished. The C1 is distinguished from the A1 by a specific set of modifications tied directly to its operational environment. The A1 was the general issue frame. The C1 had added equipment racks, reinforced atmospheric maneuvering systems, and environmental conversion packages that allowed it to operate from Karaba's airborne and seaborne platforms without requiring the kind of specialized support infrastructure that the pure spaceborne A1 demanded. Karaba, the AEUG's Black Ops ground and atmospheric wing, was the primary operator of C1 units, which is why the modifications mattered. Karaba did not operate out of fully equipped space colonies with dedicated hangars and maintenance crews. Karaba operated out of whatever they could seize, refit, or infiltrate, often under fire, often on a schedule that did not allow for careful pre-flight configuration. The C1's modifications were not theoretical upgrades. They were answers to the specific logistical problems Karaba faced every time they deployed. That meant the C1 could land on a standard airstrip and prepare for a follow-up sortie without returning to a dedicated mobile suit tender. It could integrate with ground-based command networks that the A1 was not equipped to talk to. It carried a different weapons loadout that reflected the kinds of targets Karaba actually engaged, not space warships, but ground installations, not squadrons of Titans mobile suits, but garrisons holding population centers. The frame itself was the same Zeta Plus transformable architecture. The Wave Rider configuration still worked, the core mobility was unchanged, but everything attached to the frame had been reconsidered for a specific user in a specific environment. One pilot in a C1 was operating a machine built around the assumption that resupply would be uncertain, that maintenance windows would be short, that the mission profile would require switching between space and atmosphere without returning to a mothership. That constraint shapes every decision about armor placement, ammunition storage, sensor placement, and power management in a way that the general purpose A1 never had to account for. The machine asks more of its pilot because it was built for a context where the pilot cannot ask much of anyone else. The A1 and C1 are the same frame on paper and different machines in practice. The AEUG and Karaba needed both because the war they were fighting was not one war but several overlapping conflicts, each with its own logistics, its own terrain, and its own demands on the machines they had available. The Zeta Plus C1 was built for the missions that had no hangar, no tender, and no second chances. The Zeta name on its hull was a holdover from a program that had ended. The machine itself was answering questions the original designers had never been forced to ask. MSZ-010A Zeta Plus C2. The Karaba Zeta Plus C2 exists because the C1 broke a rule nobody knew was already broken. If the rule had been real, if transforming from Mobile Suit to Wave Rider was genuinely necessary for survival in a Gryps Conflict fight, then the C1's armor cracking would have meant every Zeta Plus was a death trap, and Karaba would have had nothing to work with. Instead, Karaba simply deleted the rule. The C2 abandons the transformation function entirely. It stays in mobile suit form permanently, shedding the Wave Rider equipment that was supposed to make the platform exceptional, and keeping only the parts that make it a functional machine. The result is the Zeta Plus line doing exactly what it was always supposed to do, just through a narrower door. 4 Zeta Plus C1 units emerged from the production line before the structural failures became undeniable. AEUG held 11 Zeta Plus machines total across all 4 variants. The C2 is part of a Karaba-run program that produced a minimum of 1 confirmed unit, possibly 2 or 3, since the records blur between AEUG supply and Karaba's parallel maintenance channels. What is certain is that the machine reached operational status before the final Gryps Conflict operations, that Karaba fielded it alongside the C1 in at least 1 confirmed deployment, and that it saw combat while the AEUG's own Zeta Plus fleet was still grounded by the armor cracking problem. The C2 was not an upgraded C1, it was an entirely different engineering philosophy built on the same chassis designation. The wings retained the original's aerodynamic profile but shed the actuation hardware that allowed the transformation sequence. The armor plates were reworked with thicker rear hull coverage and simplified forward attachment points. The kind of changes that a maintenance crew makes when they stop trying to make a machine do something it was never structurally ready to do. The beam rifle mounting remained compatible with standard Federation weapon systems, which meant the C2 could be supplied from the same depots feeding every other AEUG and Karaba unit without the specialized logistics chain the C1 required. If the ordinary explanation for the C2 is that Karaba saw a production problem and made a pragmatic fix, then the condition that would have to be true for that to hold is simple. Someone in AEUG command would have had to authorize the modification, the change would have had to be documented, and the C2 would have had to be recognized as a distinct variant rather than a field repair. None of that happened. The C2 appeared in Karaba's inventory without a paper trail, without a formal designation ceremony, and without any acknowledgement from AEUG headquarters that the transformation capability was being permanently discarded. The machine that reaches the screen, the one that sits in the Zeonic front hangars with its wing binders locked in mobile suit position and its Wave Rider spine visibly sealed with field plates, is the kind of unit that exists because people on the ground decided the rulebook was wrong before anyone in headquarters noticed the book had changed. Inside the cockpit, the pilot strips off a flight suit that was supposed to accommodate 2 forms and wears something designed for 1 because the machine only asks for 1 now. Where the C2 was a Karaba variant that broke a rule by quietly deleting it, the C4 is a later mass production model that kept every rule and found a different way to fail. MSZ-010A Zeta Plus C4. The C4 is what happens when a platform survives by accident and then gets asked to justify its continued existence. If the C2's strategy was honest reduction, take away the thing that doesn't work and survive on what does. The C4's strategy was everything but reduction. Keep all the original requirements, add more of them, and somehow make them lighter. The C4 carries wing binders capable of Wave Rider transformation, carries the same core structural frame as the C1, and somehow manages to do both while wearing armor thinner than its immediate predecessor. 200 units were planned across the Zeta Plus line during the AEUG production program, with the C4 representing the final mass production configuration before the program's end. The C4's armor was stripped to its minimum functional thickness, a deliberate weight reduction that gave the machine a higher thrust-to-weight ratio than any other Zeta Plus variant, but that also made it the platform's most fragile member by a measurable margin. Zeonic-era technicians contributed to the C4's design work, bringing structural reinforcement concepts borrowed from captured MS-14 and MS-17 samples that had never been integrated into the AEUG production line before. The beam saber mounts were repositioned to the forearms rather than the backpack, a change that reduced swing radius and improved close-quarters handling, but that required the cockpit interface to be rewritten, something that pilots trained on the C1 and C2 had to relearn from scratch. The program timeline collapsed the C4 into the same post-Zeta window as the other three variants, which means all four Zeta Plus models were competing for the same production slots, the same test pilots, and the same finite supply of Gundam-type alloy at exactly the moment when the Gryps Conflict was consuming everything faster than the factories could produce it. And before you say the C4's thin armor was an acceptable trade for the mobility it gained, that kind of thinking is precisely what killed the C1, which also prioritized performance over structural integrity and ended up with a machine that cracked under the loads transformation imposed on it. The C4 repeated the mistake with better marketing. It gained 15% better acceleration figures than the C1 in Wave Rider mode, while keeping the same armor rating that had already been proven inadequate for that exact use case. The numbers on paper looked like an upgrade. The numbers on the battlefield told a different story, but the C4 never stayed on the battlefield long enough for those numbers to accumulate. It was withdrawn from frontline service within months of its first confirmed deployment and quietly reassigned to reserve and training units where the transformation requirement was rarely tested under combat stress. Defenders point out that the C4's record isn't worse than the other Zeta Plus variants because the machines were never given conditions that would expose the same flaw that killed the C1. That's not a defense. That's a confession that the program never actually validated the machine against the one scenario it was specifically designed to survive. If the C2 was the variant that admitted transformation wasn't worth the cost, then the C4 was the variant that refused to admit that and paid for it by never getting the chance to prove itself. The MSZ-007 is the machine that was supposed to exist before the Zeta did, which makes it the one unit in the entire lineup that exposes the Zeta's origin story as incomplete. MSZ-007 Zeta Gundam prototype. The MSZ-007 is the Zeta Gundam's pre-production prototype, and it carries a completely different wing configuration and an unfinished transformation mechanism, details that should not coexist in a finished machine and yet somehow do. It appears in Zeta Gundam Define as a confirmed operational unit sitting in an AEUG hangar, while the MSZ-006 Zeta Gundam moves through final testing alongside it, which means the AEUG had two transformable Gundam-type mobile suits at roughly the same stage of development and chose the less interesting-looking one to mass produce. The wings are the most immediately visible difference, where the MSZ-006 carries a single set of wing binders that double as stabilizers during transformation. The MSZ-007 has a split wing arrangement mounted directly to the backpack frame that extends outward at a wider angle, giving the machine a broader silhouette that reads as distinctly more aggressive in profile than the sleeker production model. The waist armor is shaped differently too, bulkier, with a pronounced rear extension that houses the transformation mechanism's incomplete actuator bank, a cluster of hydraulics and wiring harnesses that was never fully enclosed because the MSZ-006's cleaner integration to design made it obsolete before it was finished. The MSZ-007 retains the same beam rifle mounting configuration as the MSZ-006 and carries two beam sabers mounted on the hip, but the head unit lacks the production model's distinctive fin-like V-fin arrangement, replacing it with a single forward-swept antenna that suggests the designers were still working through the machine's sensor configuration when the program shifted focus. The MSZ-007's cockpit layout differs from the MSZ-006 in ways that suggest it was designed by a different engineering team entirely. The control column is positioned higher, the monitor array wraps further around the pilot's field of view, and the transformation activation sequence requires a separate conformation step that the MSZ-006 eliminated during its own development cycle. AEUG records from the Gryps Conflict period reference the MSZ-007 as a testbed for the Gundam-type biosensor system that would later appear in the MSZ-006's final configuration, meaning the machine was specifically built to test a technology that ended up in the machine that replaced it. That isn't how prototype programs usually work. Prototypes exist to feed data into the final design, not to be superseded by a parallel design that was developed from scratch at the same time. The AEUG committed to the MSZ-006 as their next-generation transformable mobile suit and began scaling up production while the MSZ-007 was still sitting in a hangar with its transformation system incomplete, which means two full Zeta Gundam programs were running simultaneously during the single most resource-constrained period of the entire Gryps conflict. The MSZ-007 reveals that the Zeta wasn't developed through a clean evolution from an earlier machine. It was selected from competing designs that were each far enough along to be operationally viable, and the selection had nothing to do with technical superiority. The MSZ-007's wing configuration actually offered better stability in Waverider form than the MSZ-006's binders. According to the performance data embedded in the defined continuity's technical appendices, the MSZ-006 won because it was easier to mass produce, not because it was better. What the MSZ-007 ultimately reveals about the system it belongs to is that the Zeta's origin story is a narrative convenience. The clean line from prototype to production machine never existed. What existed was a design competition that got resolved by whoever had the better political position at AEUG headquarters, and the machine that lost was good enough to fly, but not good enough to be the face of the program. The MSZ-007 is that machine, and it's the reason the Zeta's lineage has a ghost in it. FA-010A FAZZ. It takes the Zeta Gundam design and strips away its defining transformation capability entirely, trading that flexibility for heavier armor and enhanced weaponry instead. The FAZZ is a non-transformable variant appearing in the Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam series, and that single design choice placed it in an entirely different operational category from the machine it was derived from. Its weaponry is significantly heavier than the standard Zetas, and its armor is substantially thicker, but those improvements came at the cost of the capability that made the original unit able to operate in ways no standard mobile suit could match. In combat, that contradiction became immediately apparent. The FAZZs had more firepower and better protection on paper, but lacked the ability to change its configuration when the situation demanded it. The original Zeta Gundam was a prototype mobile suit, a single hand-built unit built around experimental systems that were never intended for mass production. Its biosensor interface, the system that allowed the pilot's new type ability to unlock the unit's full combat performance, required a specific pilot to operate the machine at anything near its potential. The FAZZ eliminated that dependency entirely, substituting raw weapon output instead. It mounted heavy weaponry for concentrated firepower engagements, while thick armor plating protected the frame from incoming fire, but the Waverider transformation capability of the system that let the original Zeta switch between mobile suit and cruiser configurations was completely absent, and that absence reshaped every engagement the FAZZs ever fought. In combat, the FAZZ proved devastating against static targets and in direct engagements, yet the moment the situation demanded repositioning, the pilot had no transformation option to exploit. The unit was simultaneously more powerful and less versatile than the Zeta, and in a multi-directional battlefield, versatility is what keeps a machine alive. AEUG commissioned FAZZ units for what they hoped would be a stepping stone toward heavier mass-produced Zeta variants, but the program ultimately did not advance to full production. When AEUG's leadership structure collapsed at the Gryps Conflict's end, there was no organization left to push the FAZZ forward. The completed units left no lasting operational record. The FAZZ's design trade-offs highlighted the challenges of removing the transformation capability from the Zeta platform. MSZ-006 Zeta Gundam Killer B. Where the FAZZ failed by piling firepower onto a flawed and restricted chassis, the defined novel continuity's Killer B took the opposite approach entirely, and that's where things get more complicated. The Killer B is a mass production variant, a variant from the defined novel continuity that stripped out the original Zeta's experimental biosensor interface and replaced it with a standardized control system that any competent pilot could operate. A limited production run was completed under this program. The units bore a distinctive color scheme separate from the original Zeta's livery, and the Wave Rider transformation capability remained fully intact. The biosensor interface, the same system that made the original Zeta so dependent on a specific new type pilot, was removed entirely, replaced with controls that eliminated the need for a specific pilot profile. This opened the Zeta's transformation technology to broader deployment, which is precisely what the Killer B achieved. The unit saw deployment during the Gryps conflict, and the design proved mechanically reliable when operated within its intended parameters. Confirmed losses appear in the record, and the surviving machines were integrated into the Earth Federation forces. The design's limitations become clear when you examine what it actually prioritized. The biosensor's removal allowed for genuine mass production, but it also locked the unit's performance ceiling. Without that neural interface, a pilot could extract only so much from the machine's systems regardless of skill. This wasn't a failure of the design. The Killer B's specifications confirm the systems functioned exactly as intended. The transformation capability worked, the control interface was standardized for broader use, the design prioritized operational reliability over the original Zeta's peak performance ceiling. It was built for operational missions by competent pilots, and within that envelope, the defined continuity's records show it delivering precisely what was asked of it. The losses in the final battle reflect the machine being pushed beyond its design parameters, not a design that failed on its own terms. The Zeta's defining innovation, the biosensor interface, allowed a new type pilot to push the unit past normal performance limits, but only under specific conditions. The FAZZ removed that system entirely, replacing it with concentrated firepower and armor that made the machine devastating in stationary engagements, yet completely inflexible when the situation demanded repositioning. 3 units were completed before the program dissolved. AEUG commissioned the FAs as a stepping stone toward heavier mass-produced Zeta variants, but the program received lower priority than the Zeta Plus line, and when AEUG's leadership collapsed at the Gryps conflict's end, there was no organization left to carry it forward. The FAZZ proved the category's fundamental constraint. All the extra mass and weaponry in the world means nothing if the platform's defining capability has been stripped away. Meanwhile, the defined novel continuity's Killer B variant was heading in a completely different direction.